The Denver Broncos in their 2024 NFL schedule, they must overcome their past road struggles and Eastern time zone games. We'll tell you which stretch is the toughest for the Broncos on today's brand new episode of Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's happening? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you once again to everybody in Broncos Country, all the everydayers out there who make us your first listen of the day every single day. We have a podcast for you. So if you're listening to once or twice a week, bump that up to every single day, Monday through Friday, as you get all the up-to-date information going on with your favorite team. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. Fresh off the heels of the 2024 NFL schedule release, we did our initial breakdown on yesterday's episode of the show. So if you missed that, make sure you go back and you check it out as we reacted to it as the schedule officially came out. But today we're going to also look at it a little bit more in depth in certain areas where we look at the toughest stretch of the schedule for the Broncos next season. And also we talk about the obstacles about Denver struggling on the road historically. So, Sayre, to really open things up here on today's episode of the show, can the Broncos become road warriors in 2024? We all know, based on the new scheduling format with the obviously 18 weeks of the regular season, you're going to get split between 9 home games and 8 home games. And then the next year, it'll go between 9 away games and 8 home games from that standpoint. The Broncos, at this point, they have more road games than they have home games. 9 games on the road for them this season, 8 games at home. And I think the more glaring optic here is when you look at the Broncos' first 12 weeks of their schedule, 7 of those are on the road, but that means that Denver's end stretch, there's only going to be 2 road games for them down the stretch, which I think is going to be a great benefit to them potentially if they're healthy, if they're in a good place. But Denver is going to have to become a little bit of a road warrior in 2024. They weren't as great last year, even though they did win some big games in 2023 on the road. When it mattered down the end stretch there, Houston, Detroit, they simply couldn't get it done.
And that was tough to watch, wasn't it? Because they were in that Houston game for sure. They got beat pretty good against Detroit, but against Houston, they were in that game. And I think you look at this Broncos team, Cody, in terms of the most miles traveled this season. I mean, the Broncos are kind of middle of the pack. So I know there is a lot of traveling going on, but I think the Chargers are the team that has to travel the most out of any NFL team, if I remember correctly. But it's going to be a situation that prepares you if, let's say, the Broncos are able to get into the postseason this year. I think having 9 away games, having 9 away games really is going to help you with that, because if you make the playoffs by some stroke, you're going to have to go on the road most likely anyway. So it's going to prepare this team. I think, to me, when you look at the schedule overall right now, it really, like you said, that early slate is going to define whether or not this team can end up doing anything late in the season. Because, like you said, they play 7 of those first 12 games on the road. And as of last season, Cody, I mean, you look at this Broncos team, they were not great on the road, but they played some tough matchups, right? They were 3-5 last season in away games, only 5-4 at home. And I think, to me, on this schedule, the much tougher opponents happen on the road. The Broncos get a little bit of a cakewalk, so to speak, when they play their home games this year as compared to who they have to face on the road. So it's not just about, man, you got 9 road games. It's that you're playing some of the toughest teams on your schedule when you go on the road.
And not to mention, you're going to open up your first 4 games of the season. 3 of your first 4 are going to be on the road. We talk about that matchup against the Seahawks. We always know in Seattle, it is so loud. So if Bo Nix is the starting quarterback for week 1, how does he handle a loud environment? Though I will say he's not a stranger to that, because when he was the quarterback of the Oregon Ducks, he went on the road at Washington, where it's also very raucous and loud, not far away from the Seahawks stadium. And all of a sudden, like, he was able to drown that out. He's won a road game before at Washington. Didn't happen last year. It happened in 2022. He's no stranger to being, a guy who can perform really well when it is in a loud environment. So I think that's maybe a good benefit there, but it is a different level of loudness in Seattle. I mean, I was there for that Monday night game, Russ's return there, and I had never been in a stadium that is so loud. I think it was louder than what most people say Arrowhead Stadium gets sometimes. That was a truly raucous environment there. Then obviously, you have 2 back-to-back road games going on in weeks 3 and weeks 4. You're on the road against Tampa Bay. We all know they have a pretty talented defense. They just locked in Antoine Winfield Jr. to a long-term deal, highest paid safety in the National Football League. And then you have a tough game against the New York Jets, who, look, at that point, we assume Aaron Rodgers probably going to be healthy. Then you're going to have that tough defense as well. Like, New York is also very tough. John Franklin Myers is going to make his return to the Meadowlands to take on his former team. I just think overall the first part of Denver's schedule when we talk about road games is tough. Then obviously that Thursday night game against the New Orleans Saints, tough defense, that tough atmosphere and environment there. And then you're going to obviously, we'll get into maybe the tougher stretches of the Broncos season a little bit later, but I mean, they're going to be tested early on. And I know a lot of people are going through their record predictions right now, trying to predict, okay, this is going to be a win. This is going to be us. It's a fun little exercise. At the end of the day, it's meaningless. I think you and I are still both in agreement, even though that we talked about on yesterday's show that the schedule is tough on paper. Like, it looks brutal on paper in terms of just who they have to play and when they have to play and what that looks like and back-to-back opponents, things like that. I'm still taking, and I don't know if your thoughts changed on this, but I'm still taking the over 5.5 wins on the Broncos this season. I'm not going to give an official record prediction. I don't believe in that stuff, but I do think they're going to win more than 5 games. I'm going to take the over in that. Do you still feel the same after the schedule release has come out?
Yeah, I'm smashing the over. I initially kind of looking over the schedule, Cody, I'm saying 9 or 10 wins for the Broncos. And I think 9 wins would obviously be a 1-game improvement from last year. 10 games would be a 2-win improvement. So I think a lot of people kind of perceive last year as being like it disappeared or something like that. It's almost like the Broncos are coming off the 2022 season, the way that people talk about them, but they won 8 games last year. I don't know who needs to be reminded of that, but that is the reality. And when you look at this early on in the season, I think you're at Seattle. That's a tough environment, but is Seattle one of the best teams on Denver's schedule? Absolutely not. I mean, that's a winnable game. Tampa Bay, they made the playoffs and they won a playoff game last year. And yeah, you got to go to the state of Florida in September, which we know it's going to be 200 plus degrees. That is going to be tough, but the Bucs are a beatable team. I mean, they're not some world beaters out there with Tom Brady fresh off a Super Bowl win. They're a good team, and the Broncos are going to have to beat good teams if they want to do what good teams do, which is make the playoffs. And so I think you're 100% right, Cody. This first portion of the schedule here, 7 of the first 12 being on the road. You've got 2 11 a.m. Mountain Time games, that Tampa Bay game, the New York Jets game, and then week 9 is your next one against Baltimore. To me, that kind of stuff does it almost play in the Broncos' favor to be away from home early in the season, because the expectations in Broncos country, when there's still expectations to be had, the fans are the ones that were, remember, against in Russell Wilson's second or third game, they're counting down the play clock, right? And the pressure from the home fans in Denver is so intense, especially when the season is still alive. So it almost works to the Broncos' benefit to be working away from home. It's kind of like, just any other situation where it's like, I got to get out of the office for a bit, or I got to go, I work from home, but I got to go to the coffee shop for a bit and just be productive. It's not the exact same. I get it, but it's kind of similar in the fact that the Broncos are going to be away from home for most of the first half or the first 2/3 of the season. And it could work to their benefit in many ways to be able to have the pressures on the home team to get a win. And everybody's going to be saying, well, you should beat the Broncos. That team sucks. I mean, when the Broncos come in and they're much better on the defensive line and the offensive line that people expect, and when the quarterback's not making a ton of mistakes, and when the Broncos are able to run the ball, it's going to be interesting to see how that pressure on those home teams impacts the way the Broncos are able to kind of maybe win the time of possession game, settle the crowd down, get the crowd on their side instead of the other team. I mean, it's interesting how it works, Cody, but I could see it playing in the Broncos' favor a little bit.
In Broncos country, we want to know your thoughts on the Broncos' road struggles of history, and can they overcome that here in 2024? Make sure you let us know if you're watching or listening Locked On Broncos on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Sayre and I, we're going to share our thoughts on what we believe is going to be the toughest stretch of the 2024 schedule for the Broncos. What might that look like for the team? And could Bo Nix maybe show that he's the guy during his first season? We'll look at that and much more here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos country, today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. And as you all know, at FanDuel, they are America's #1 sportsbook. And right now is the perfect time to get in on all the action, because you have the NBA and the NHL playoffs ongoing right now, and it's winner take all time inside the FanDuel Sportsbook app because FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Whether a game goes 7 series in the NBA or the NHL playoffs, FanDuel is the place where you can get in on the action. So make sure you visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook.
The 2024 season for the Denver Broncos could be a tale of two halves. Cody says that the second half of the year might be the toughest. I'm saying maybe the first half of the year could be the toughest. We're going to break it all down on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, but want to say thank you and give a shout out to all of you that make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, wherever you listen to podcasts, free and available on all platforms, as well as you can watch the show on YouTube. And like Cody said earlier, if you've been listening 1 or 2 times a week, man, bump it up. Get us in the algorithm if you're on YouTube, or if you listen on your commute in the car, jump into Locked On Broncos every single day to stay updated on all things Denver Broncos. Let's talk about this, Cody, in terms of the toughest stretch on the schedule. I think it can honestly be broken down in terms of a tale of two halves here. You have weeks 1 through 9, and then you have weeks 9 through 18 as kind of that Baltimore Ravens game in week 9 as the pivot point of the season. I think that has to be included in any difficult stretch of this season. But we're talking about what's the toughest stretch here, and I want to hear from you. What do you say is the tougher stretch between those two halves? We could break it down to an individual 4 or 5 game stretch, but I think you're onto something here. Weeks 9 through 18. Why do you say that's the toughest stretch of the year for the Broncos this year?
Well, I mean, just for the reasons that you said, you look at it like you start off that stretch with 2 back-to-back road games, which are Eastern time zone, 11 a.m. Well, obviously Eastern and Central, but 11 a.m. Mountain Time kickoffs, which the Broncos historically, as of late, have not performed well in those windows and those early slates. But you're playing Lamar Jackson and the Ravens. You're playing Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. And when you look at from weeks 9 through 18, 8 of those 9 remaining games are against AFC opponents. And, I mean, you can make the argument there that maybe Atlanta is in the playoff consideration with Kirk Cousins. I mean, they've upgraded their offensive weaponry quite a bit this year. Obviously, they're going to go through new changes. They got a new head coach. On paper right now, you expect the Falcons to be better than they were last year. But I look at that, and you look at those final games, like 8 of those games being against AFC conference opponents, like that's where Denver has to take care of business. And look, you talk about the Ravens, the Chiefs. Well, if you skip the Falcons game because they're NFC non-conference, then you're on the road at Las Vegas, where the Broncos have struggled against the Raiders for the past handful of years. You play a Cleveland Browns team that was in the playoffs. They have a good defense. Will their offense be better next season, especially if Deshaun Watson is healthy? Great question there. Anthony Richardson, the Colts in week 15. I mean, they're young. He's electric. He's shown flashes, but they also have a very, very good defense. And then you're on the road at the Los Angeles Chargers, which you can say this every year. For Denver, that kind of ends up being almost like a home game because Broncos Country travels really well. There are a lot of Broncos fans in California, and Los Angeles is a little bit of an oversaturated market because you have 2 professional football teams that play in the same arena. You're going to get a large influx of opposing teams' fans in that situation. But then I really think, okay, then you're on the road in late December against Joe Burrow. That's when he plays his best football. And then once again, Patrick Mahomes and Kansas City Chiefs. Ideally, from week 9 to week 18, that is the most difficult stretch for this team on paper, considering the quality of opponents based on just what we're factoring in off last year, the changes that these teams have made so far. And you can also make an argument for the first half. So that's kind of where I want to throw it to you. Do you think the first half of the schedule is probably going to be the toughest stretch for Denver? Explain to me why and what factored into that for you here.
Well, I think what we talked about before about having 7 of those first 12 games on the road is huge there, but I'm breaking it down from weeks 1 through 9. So just like you, Cody, I'm including that Baltimore game in the toughest stretch. But really, when it comes to early on in the season, it feels like the Broncos have been their own worst enemy in recent years, right? It feels like that's kind of been where this team has gone off the rails a little bit too much to be able to maybe climb back in later in the season. I think when you talk about a built-in margin for error, this is the area of the season that the Broncos have really struggled. They haven't been able to get off to a strong start the last handful of years. they've struggled. Sean Payton historically has struggled to get things going in September compared to other months. And so I think it's really with this team, you don't have the same margin for error that a team like Kansas City does, right? Last year, we saw Kansas City kind of struggling throughout the first 2/3 of the season or what have you. And then they turn things on late. And obviously, they go ahead and win the Super Bowl. They have that kind of margin for error. And that's just how talented and good that team is. So much roster carryover. I don't think the Broncos really have that. I think they need to get off to a hot start. And when you're talking about 3 of the first 4 games being on the road, 3 of the first 4 games being against top 12 defenses in terms of points allowed from last year, meaning the Pittsburgh Steelers, and then obviously the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and New York Jets, it's 3 of the top 12 from last year. I think that first stretch of games, weeks 1 through 9. So I guess that's the first 9 games of the year, which is a long stretch, if you want to call it that. But the Saints, they were a dominant defense last year. The Ravens, they were a dominant defense last year. Those are teams that when you have a rookie quarterback, you need him to get going rather quickly. I think that's going to be the toughest test for the Broncos in terms of, can you hit the ground running? You don't really have the time. If your plan is to make the playoffs this year, you don't really have the time to struggle through the first 7-8 weeks of the season and go, 2-5, 2-6. You can't, that's not going to work this year like last year where the Broncos almost came back. That to me makes it the toughest stretch. Is a combination of history. You need a rookie quarterback to get things going against a lot of top 10, top 12 defenses from a year ago. And that is going to be tough.
That is a tough formula. And look, I think we all assume and we all believe that Bo Nix is going to be the starting quarterback week 1. There's some people that watch and listen to the show that think it's going to be Jarrett Stidham. There's some that think it's going to be Zach Wilson. I mean, ideally, that's tough regardless, even if it's a rookie quarterback, even if it's Zach Wilson, even if it's Jarrett Stidham. Like, you have to have better quarterback play during this time. And I'm very curious to see, can the Broncos' run game be better? Because if Denver can run the ball effectively against some of these top 10 defenses from last year, I think they are going to have a really good chance. But you also take the pressure off of a rookie quarterback. So ideally, I think some of the things we want to see happen, especially to start the year, is to know, like, okay, going into it, Broncos country, like, even though Bo Nix was drafted as high as he was, and let's say he's the starter week 1, it's hard to come in and say, hey, Bo, you need to throw for 350 yards and 4 touchdowns consistently and not struggle one bit. Like, you're going to have to let Bo go through struggles if he struggles. Like, you're going to have to let him go through that because it's absolutely imperative for growth. I think so many people forget, not saying he's going to be the next Peyton Manning, but I think so many people, because of what Peyton Manning has accomplished in his career, so many people forget about Peyton Manning's rookie season that he had in the NFL. So let him struggle. Let him go through the ups and downs. This year, ideally, a lot of fans have said it in our comments and in our social media feeds that they still view this as a rebuilding year. So let them go through that. Let them go through the ups and downs. And hey, if Denver surprises, wins games, plays well, Bo Nix looks great, there's a lot to be excited about here. But ideally, understand that struggles are expected at various points of the season, regardless of who the quarterback is. Do the Broncos have a good enough system in place around him to be able to withstand that? And that, what I talk about that is like, is the defense going to be better than they were last year? Is the run game going to be effective? If those two things are true and they are better, Denver does have a really good shot, I think, to get off to a really nice start to this season. And maybe they can withstand that throughout the end stretch, or what I believe is the hardest stretch of the schedule from weeks 9 through weeks 18. And look, this is where we open it up to Broncos country. When you look at this schedule, what is the most difficult stretch in your opinion for this team? Are you in agreement with Sayre with weeks 1 through 9, or are you in agreement with me, weeks 9 through 18? Make sure you let us know if you're watching or listening to Locked On Broncos, wherever you get your podcasts, or available on YouTube. But we do have some Broncos news, some roster moves. There is going to be a position competition for the starting punter job. We'll dive deep into that and much more here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos country, today's episode, Locked On Broncos. We want to thank our sponsor, eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, whether you get superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. And whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts that you need at the prices that you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Once again, that's ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Competition aplenty as the Broncos approach the offseason. You have mini camp and you have OTAs are coming up for the Broncos in the next week. They'll be back on the field. Not only just rookies, but veterans alike will be on the field. And things are going to get a little bit more exciting here on Broncos Country. We have you up to date here every single day on the Locked On Broncos podcast. So like I said, if you're listening to a Monday and Tuesday episode of the show, make sure you start listening to Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday episodes of the show, because we have you covered legitimately every single day, all year long. We always try to have new conversations versus repetitive topics and things of that nature. So we appreciate you so much, Broncos Country, for rocking with us and making us your first listen of the day every single day. Bump that listening ship up. If you're listening 2 times, like I said, get it to 5 times a week. We appreciate you so much, Broncos Country, because things are getting exciting as training camp is just around the corner. Sayre, speaking of training camp, we all know there's going to be various position battles and competition across the board. That's what Sean Payton wants. One I don't think we necessarily expected, at least going into the offseason, was that the Broncos were going to have a punter competition. Yes, and I know you guys are talking about punters. We talk about everybody on the show. If there's a long snapper competition, we're going to be talking about that as well. But all kidding aside, like, you look at this, the Broncos made a move. They waived one of their undrafted rookie free agents, Cam Allen. He was a safety, and they brought in punter Trenton Gill, who formerly punted for the Chicago Bears. They brought him in to compete with Riley Dixon, who, I'll be very honest with you, Sayre, looking at Riley Dixon, how he performed last season, he was a bright spot for the Broncos special teams unit. Look, Denver had one of the best special teams units in the NFL. Riley Dixon was very, very good at what he did last year. So I'm curious, maybe to the thought process, why is it that Sean Payton, maybe Mike Westhoff or Ben Kotwica, why did they feel like they needed to bring in a new punter to maybe push Riley Dixon a little bit? To me, I find it a little intriguing, especially at this point of the offseason.
It is very intriguing, and shout out to anybody who's watching on YouTube and can type in the comments the name of the Broncos long snapper without looking it up. Let us know you're listening by doing that for us. Go ahead and type his name down there. But look, Cody, I'm intrigued by this as well, because we didn't see competition come in really for kicker Will Lutz, and maybe we still will. But now you bring in Trenton Gill to compete with Riley Dixon, who, like you said, last year had a good year, 46.3 yards per punt, 41.5 net, and 27 kicks inside the 20. Gill was not on that same level of production last year. 46.1 yards per punt, 38.0 net yards per kick, and then 18 inside the 20. Now, a lot of different things factor into that. The Bears were not one of the they were not one of the teams last year that was consistently going 3 and out, and they were top 10 in terms of starting field position. So you would think that if your punter doesn't have a lot of kicks inside the 20, you're either scoring a lot of points, which the Bears didn't necessarily do, but either that or you're not moving the ball a ton. And the Bears were moving the ball. They averaged 8 plays per drive. And like I said, their starting field position was 8th best in the NFL last year. So it's not like Gill was working what different punters can do in the mile high air, because it doesn't feel like, even as good as Denver, and maybe there's no statistical evidence, comes in with this mindset that I'm going to be able to having to back up for the opposing punter, whereas there's much more of an infrequency with that in terms of what Riley Dixon or whoever the Broncos punter has been. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe it's just my perception. Maybe I'm not.
As much as we've talked about quarterback, talked about right tackle, the Broncos, and that goes on there. But Riley Dixon, I feel like, has probably been the most consistent guy that the Broncos have had really in recent memory, dating back to Britton Colquitt, since he was on the roster initially during that Super Bowl run, which, I mean, it's a long time ago, right? So for Riley, not only that, he's an athlete. He can throw the ball. He can run the ball. He's very good in that regard there. I would say maybe another thing here, like you look at Trenton Gill, like his longest punt last season, Sayre, 76 yards. Like, that's pretty amazing. Like, and I'm not sure who that was against or where that was. Part of me is wondering if it was that Thursday night game against the Commanders. I wonder if that was the case there. I think I recall seeing something like that, watching that game. Riley Dixon, obviously, I think it was 60 or 65 yards, which was his longest punt. Where you look at the benefit or like the comparison between these two guys, you mentioned it. Like Denver had one of the best coverage units in the NFL last season with Tremont Smith, Riley Moss really as those gunners getting downfield, which is why you look at obviously Dixon's yards per punt. I mean, really pretty solid in the NFL. You look at the net yards, right? And usually they factor in, okay, how many return yards the opposing team gets. That's a big indicator of good coverage by the Broncos, which, Sayre, how many years have we been on this show? And we've been saying, like, man, the Broncos special teams unit, their punt coverage stinks. Like last year, it was incredible. It was so nice to get on and talk about a game. Like we never had an instance where we got onto a post-game show and we're like, the Broncos lost this game because they couldn't, cover the punt relatively well. Like they get down there, they do a really good job. They have guys emerging and making plays there. I'm excited about that. To me, maybe you're going to see, okay, hey, how does Riley Dixon at this point, obviously a veteran, how does he respond to competition? Can he maintain that? Like he was really good at training camp last year. So he's going to have a really bad performance, in my opinion, in order to be unseated. Though part of me also wonders, could it also be a financial move? Like it's not like Riley Dixon's making a ton of money, but maybe maybe Gill would be a little bit of a cheaper option for them. But I don't know. I just think that when we look at this, part of me is also wondering, okay, you just signed Will Lutz to an extension. I don't think you're bringing in a competition for him, though I think they had the Oregon kicker, I think Cam Lewis, one of the undrafted rookie free agents. They had him at like the tryout during rookie minicamp. I don't think you can read anything into that there. But ideally, it's like we expect the competitions to really headline offense, defense, like quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. How's that going to go? And now we're sitting here. It's like, hey, we're talking about a punter competition in the month of May. Like what, I don't think it's going to be something that's going to define the Broncos. But I think Riley Dixon, in my opinion, is probably as good as the Broncos have had in many years. What can Gill do to maybe come in and unseat him? That's something maybe I'm going to be curious to see going forward. And we get our first look at that next week when the Broncos are on the field for OTAs.
Well, one thing that I'm interested by as well is the kickoff game, right? And Sean Payton has acknowledged how important the new kickoff rules are going to be. And he talked about at the rookie minicamp how it's not just a matter of fielding kickoffs anymore. He basically compared the return men to like infielders in baseball, like a shortstop. You're going to have to field, goofy hops on kicks and things like that. Teams are going to. So Trenton Gill had 40 kickoffs for the Chicago Bears over the last 2 years. I wonder if that's part of it. Not that Will Lutz can't kick off, but I wonder if this
just let Will kick field goals and PATs. Yeah, just let him do that.
Let him do that. Let him focus on that completely and let this guy put the funky spin on the kickoff or whatever they're trying to do. Maybe that is a factor in it. And maybe they saw something because we know Ben Kotwika, Mike Westhoff, all those guys and Sean Payton loves special teams. And he talked about all the hidden yardage. They are going to try to find any way to win that advantage in the hidden yardage department every single week. I wouldn't be surprised if there was something to Gill being a potential kickoff specialist with these new rules in place.
Oh, Broncos country, we're going to see some competition. We're excited because the Broncos back on the field next week, Tuesday through Thursday, as organized team activities continue. I'll be there in person covering. We'll have a complete recap and coverage of practice and what we see and what we learn every single day here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. Sayre Bedinger, myself, we love to break it down for all of you in Broncos country. Thank you once again to everybody in Broncos country, all the everydayers out there who make us your first listen. If you're listening on Monday or Wednesday, make sure you listen Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, because this is the best place to be if you want short, sweet, to the point, objective Broncos coverage without hot takes, without clickbait. We love the discussion. We love interacting with all of you in Broncos country. That'll wrap up today's episode of the show. Sayre Bedinger, myself, we're going to be back on Monday for a brand new episode of the show, setting the table for the week as the Broncos get back on the field in OTAs. The veterans will be on the field with the rookies. We'll answer some of the biggest questions we have as the Broncos head into OTAs for that period. You can expect that on Monday's episode, Locked On Broncos.